Joining us now is Signifyd's co-founder and CEO, Raj Ramanand. Raj, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Let's start off though.
Yes.
Give our audience a little bit of a refresher on what Signifyd is, and as well as your background too. We always like to get to know our guests a little bit when we can.
I've been in the payments, retail, and risk space for about 25 odd years. I started my background on the retail side with FedEx Corporation on the logistics elements of it.
Oh
Learned a
wow.
little bit of logistics and fraud over there. Then moved to the Bay Area to run emerging markets risk at PayPal. That time, emerging markets back in the day was Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. I don't know if it still stays that way. Learned a lot about payments and fraud at that point in time, and then branched off to start Signifyd back in 2011 with my co-founder, Mike Liberty, who actually ran digital goods risk at PayPal at that time. Um, it was an interesting time. We learned a lot about the space through those different journeys, obviously. But one of the interesting things that was happening at that time, this was back 2011, if you recall, um, mostly everybody at that time in retail were focused around reducing fraud. And in the retail space online, when somebody buys something, the merchant always is liable for that. Most people don't know.
Right.
It's an interesting tidbit of information. But obviously, what that meant was because retailers were liable for that fraud, they were putting in these protections in place that effectively blocked the good and the bad. And while reducing that fraud, they ended up actually turning away billions and billions of dollars of good transactions and good people who were trying to buy. So this was, think anywhere from, it could have been a 1% for some of the really large potential retailers, and some of them declining 15-20% of their top line traffic. And that was where the opportunity came. For Signifyd, we saw this massive opportunity in saying, instead of focusing on using AI to just protect the bad and help retailers reduce their fraud, what if we could turn that around and use AI for good, which is to be able to approve more and more of these good users such that you could drive growth in the top line from 2% to 20%, depending on how much you could approve. And so it was the genesis of that. And that obviously built on a lot of other things we've done after that, which is protecting the entire customer journey in each of these sort of risk elements, not just at the checkout layer.
I think two things from what you just said. One, I find the idea of finding the hidden dollars in really understanding fraud inherently interesting. But then two, 25 years in payments, that means you're a glutton for punishment, I think, as well. So what is it that you find so what is it that you find so exhilarating about this space? I'm curious.
When you think about businesses in general, they're the amalgamation of a lot of decisions people make across many different facets of the business. It could be, I'm going to launch this promotion in retail today, and that's going to drive this elements of my business. I'm going to launch this new product line. I'm going to launch a new geography that's going to come out. I'm going to make tweaks in cost reduction and how I'm going to monetize my existing customers better than just acquisition of new customers. All of that business decisions that happen in any sort of retailer today ultimately boil down to how you operate the underlying aspects of the business, whether it's logistics, whether it's
Mhm.
payments, or whether that's
Payments,
risk.
yeah. Hmm.
Without the combination of this three, the logistics side of it, the payment side of it, and the risk side of it, all of these decisions can't be executed against.
But I'm curious what you feel like the biggest issues plaguing the retailers and brands that you talk to now are. What are they focused on?
The biggest thing that's happening in this space right now for retail is tied to the concept of returns. I think we
Okay.
all deal with this in
Keep
some
hearing that.
shape or form today, where we buy something and we return it. And for the most part, we're all good people. We're not trying to abuse the system. But returns is now a $890 billion problem globally.
Hmm.
And if I'm a retailer where I sell something and then have to figure out how to adjust my books or forecast these returns, you literally are saying that everything I sell, there's an X% of that, depending on the business. In say fashion, it could be 30% of everything bought online is a return. You as the retailer have to deal with all of that. It comes down to how do you monetize that consumer again when a return happens. And then the second problem that people are trying to deal with is how do I make sure that the customer experience is really good when they make that return, such that the loyalty or the lifetime value of that customer sort of is sticky enough? And there are lots of risk problems or fraud problems that sort of drive this whole thing. But those are the two real big issues we're seeing in retail around returns right now.
What do you predict are some of the big changes that we'll see retailers try to make to achieve more profitable growth?
Let's take the two examples. We'll take the first one, which is all about when you buy a pair of shoes. Let's say you buy a pair of shoes and it doesn't fit, just for the
Yeah.
sake. And you want to return that pair of shoes. When you return that pair of shoes today, it takes 7 to 20 days for most retailers to put the money back on your credit card.
Right.
Now, it's not that the payment rails don't exist to put that money back on your credit card. The payment rails exist. They could put it back tomorrow if they wanted to put it. But the reason they hold it is because they have to wait for you to send those pair of shoes back. They have to open the box and they have to make sure that the shoes that you bought is the shoes that you return. You didn't return like a stone in there. And that process to be able to do it takes it from the time you ship it, it needs to go to a warehouse, somebody needs to open it, they have to validate, put it back in a system, and then they put the money to come back on your card. But ultimately, what's happening is it's a trust issue, right? Like, do I believe that you're going to send me that pair of shoes back? But if I could tell you at the point of return that when you initiate that return, even before you ship it, that, hey, you will return that, and I put that money back on your card instantly, what we found is that buyers tend to buy somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% of the time more again with that retailer at that point itself. So you effectively don't
Really?
go back and reacquire the customer simply because they got that money back instantly. And that's a big deal, right? Because
Yeah.
reacquisition cost is pretty expensive. So what's happening in the market, you'll see, is that more and more retailers are going to realize that this concept of instant refunds
Hmm.
is going to become the norm for the future. And there are a few great retailers who do that. We work with them and we can get into more of the details of how we do it. But ultimately, if you can give that money back instantly to the customer, then you effectively have that repurchase rate to be higher. So I think that's going to be one thing that people are going to do in the future. And it's going to be over the next 12 to 24 months, a high adoption of that. And so then the second one, which, I talked about this $890 billion problem, every retailer has returns. It's a natural part of the business. But there's more obvious issues in avoidable returns that can be avoided. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
People do promotions all the time at retailers. These promotions are being done by the marketing teams, and they do things like, hey, if you buy $200 worth of product, we give you 25% off. These promotions from the marketing team are disconnected from the operations teams.
Mm.
So what happens is that I, as the consumer, it's just like, wow, I'm going to get a 25% off. I buy $200 worth of product. I keep the one thing I want from that 200. Say I buy 4 things, I return 3, but I get to keep my discount.
Mm.
So I could have avoided those returns, right? The 3 things that you returned to me, you're a good buyer. You were just trying to avail the discount, but I could have avoided those 3 things because I knew you were trying to avail that discount, but you bought 4 because you got the discount.
Mm-hmm.
There's a disconnect between the top of the funnel where marketing is running programs
Mhm.
and the operational elements of how people have to deal with the messiness of returns. And if you can connect these things together, you can avoid a lot of returns. And that 890 billion doesn't have to become about penalizing the customer of saying, I'm going to charge you $7 for every return. Then there are lots of good customers who are never going to return and paying $7 versus finding ways to just avoid the return in the first place by doing the right things, connecting the top of the funnel, the front end with the back end.
Mm-hmm. So Raj, I'm glad we had to do the second one because the first one I can conceptualize, get my head around in terms of how you can understand the consumer that's returning the product and whether or not you want to give them an instant refund, by applying technology to help you understand that. The second one's a little bit more complicated to me as a former retail executive. So like, how do you see technology bridging that gap between marketing and operations in actuality? Because it's a hard problem to solve.
I wouldn't discount the fact, and it's a good question. I wouldn't discount the fact that this is a hard problem, and that's why it's not being solved, right? It's a very
Right.
complex thing. I think the way to think about the problem is more about a visibility problem before you can solve the problem.
Okay.
Think solving for the visibility is a pretty powerful thing in our industry right now. Like most people
Hmm.
who run returns teams, you go and talk to any retailer, you go into any one of them, they now have returns VPs, just kind of sit there and looking at how do you deal with returns? What do you do to manage costs? And most of them, if you really look at what's happening in the space, are really optimizing their logistics costs.
Right.
They go in and negotiate their price with UPS and FedEx, and that's really what they're doing.
Right.
And they're doing other things. There's a lot more, but that's sort of where their prime focus is I manage a big vendor and contracts, and I'm going to negotiate prices down, and I keep kind of getting my costs down. But ultimately, what they're missing is their mission control, like one place to look and understand what are all the reasons for my returns coming in? How do I look at the different types of the returns? What is causing these returns to come in? How do you connect the dots between buyer habits and what's happening? How do you look at that consumer outside of my network and know are they typically doing a lot of these types of promotional abuse or loyalty abuse? Do they like to wardrobe? Do they like to bracket? You can understand the holistic
Yeah.
that consumer. And if you can understand the different patterns happening, and you say, these are my top 10 reasons for how I can avoid the return from happening, now you start putting solutions in place to be able to reduce it. But I think if I were to zoom out and answer your question, I think the VP of return that's optimizing logistics contracts and doing other things doesn't have their mission control where they can understand how to avoid those returns. And there's lots of pockets for opportunity in this space.
So, Raj, is that where you would say then that because of AI being a part of this experience to kind of gather all of those touch points and put that into one dashboard for the VP of returns or whatever executive might be in charge of kind of managing or overseeing this process, is that where AI is really making this experience better for the consumers and better for the business bottom line?
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the most powerful things that has happened in this space over the past 10 years is that the amount or the explosion of consumer data is pretty high, but also it's not just about the transactional elements of the data, it's everything pre-transaction. How long does someone spend on your return policies before they buy your product? Like
Right.
what we found, if someone has spent a lot of time looking at your return policies before they buy something, they're most likely not going to return,
Mm.
right?
Interesting.
Like they're most likely not going to return because they've really thought about what this is going to look like
Right.
and done it, right? There'll be cases people return, but how do you take that data that's happening pre-transaction, even before someone click checkout, and use that in your intelligence to how you tailor the policies for your returns? Could be a very interesting thing that happens. You then have the checkout data, which is everything about what someone's purchasing. And then you have all the post-purchase data that's happening in the world today. How frequently does someone return? Why did they return something? What are the return reasons that come with it? Normalizing those return codes across all of retail is very hard to do, and tying all that together. And so where AI plays a massive part is bringing all that together and building predictive elements to be able to say with certainty, I think this person is really good. You may think that they're a first-time buyer for yourself. You may think that this person is looking abusive, but they're actually not. They're really good people. And if you follow that journey, almost from the time someone lands on your website all the way down to when they return something, and you've gone through the elements to connect that journey, you effectively now have a very predictive way of saying, this is how I should treat my customer. As opposed to this one size fits all of how you treat them, you use AI to be able to tailor that experience to the end customer.
The way you just described that was really great. I mean, the way the way I'd summarize it is really like knowledge and data is power to understand, how you want to approach your end consumer at the end of the day and what services and experiences you want to offer them. So, all right. Well, with that said, Shop Talk, we're all getting geared up for it. What is your favorite thing about Shop Talk, or your favorite thing to do while you're out there?
So the biggest thing I enjoy about Shop Talk, and I'm sure most of my peer group does as well, is that it brings together the most elite minds thinking about the future of retail in one place. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way. And
Yeah.
the energy that comes from that and getting to meet those people and hear about what different businesses and what verticals in retail are doing about the future and being able to tie that together, I think is the most powerful part of that. And obviously, just to be able to hang out with your peer group that you've known for a long time. I think you don't get those opportunities in big groups often, and so I typically like that as well.
Nice. So it's not the blackjack table, Raj. It's not the blackjack table.
That he'll admit on this session.
Not the drinks, not the blackjack, none of that. But my co-founder would like the blackjack. He was a professional blackjack player at some point in his life, so
Oh
he
my
would.
Oh my God,
Of
professional
course.
blackjack player? Wow, I didn't know there was such a thing. Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Raj, for taking the time with us today. Before we let you go, what's the best way for people to connect with you next week when they're out at Shop Talk?
That's great. So we do have a strong presence there at Shop Talk from Signifyd. You can find us at booth 1906 on the floor.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Raj. We'll see you there.